Hello and welcome to this video. This video is going to be called a video for people who hate Frank Zappa. Now you probably think the fact that I'm such a Frank Zappa fan that I'm going to sort of try and persuade you that Frank Zappa was a great guy and he was a brilliant musician and his music's amazing, but I'm not. I'm going to explore the idea myself and I'm going to try and sit back and be a little bit objective. But I do feel that when we start to tackle this, we stray into an aesthetics framework, which is sometimes framed as being a sort of ethical, moral, or even a political framework. And I'm going to try and get across my underlying point that music and art create an aesthetic framework to how we see the world. And that, encased within that aesthetic framework, is our moral framework. And from that moral framework, we get our political framework. People often see this as the other way around, but I don't think it is. I think our political framework actually is rooted in negotiations about what we think is beautiful and what we think is not beautiful. And that's a negotiation. I'm going to try and give you an example of what I mean by that. Here in the UK, the Royal Mail, who handle the postage service, they had a computer error going on in their system for a number of years, which looked like many of their employees were stealing from them. And they took hundreds of people to court, and many people actually went to prison. People were trying to get across that this wasn't right and it needs to be investigated, but the powers that be, being the powers that be, were stood fast and steadfast in their opposition to doing such a thing. Anyway, recently the BBC made a drama series, a piece of art that told a story and not only got across what actually happened in terms of factual events, but also put across what it felt like. It put across what it felt like to be a person in that situation. And once the general public understood what that was, there was an outcry. And politically, see, that affects the moral outlook of everybody. And then politically, there was pressure to look into this. And eventually the woman that was in charge, she had to resign. And it got somewhere. Now, it's so often the case that to make an ethical decision, we have to understand what it's like for somebody else to be having that emotional response, that feeling, okay? And that's very, very important. That's something that art does. People who are very artsy-fartsy can tend to be very touchy-feely. And so rational arguments, logic, is also something that can get forgotten in just working from your emotions. But you could also have within art the idea of rationalism and logic, which is often represented by the idea of perfection. It's how perfect and in order the art is. And that can be represented, for example, if you wanted to see the solidity, the sort of conservative view of the solidity of a Western democracy, that would be embodied perhaps with some architecture which goes back to sort of the Romanesque aesthetic, statues. And when we see that, or just even just walking into a cathedral, which is trying to embody the eternal qualities of the Christian church. And as you walk in, even as an atheist, if you walk in, you feel something of that order. I've said repeatedly on this channel that art is the negotiation between chaos and order. And chaos and order points to a much bigger dialectic that we cannot actually describe, but it embodies itself in all sorts of positions, all sorts of viewpoints of the world. In other words, human beings are, they're perceiving the world inside a dialectic. And what happens morally is we decide to side with one side of the dialectic or the other side of the dialectic. The dialectic could be right-wing or left-wing. The dialectic could be, the female aspect of something or the male aspect of something. So when people start to talk about, say, a white supremacy, or they're talking about a patriarchy or misogyny, what they're doing, they're seeing the world in terms of a dialectic, and they're deciding to side on one of the sides. Now, I have the view that this needs to be negotiated. It needs to be negotiated based upon specific cultural events, timescales. In other words, for human beings to move forward, this has to be continually negotiated. Now, where did I get this idea from? I got this idea from Frank Zappa. So in probably around about 1984, I would say, maybe 85, I discovered Zappa. I was into jazz fusion and prog. I'd bought Hot Rats. I thought it was great. Lots of extensive guitar solos and complexity and beautiful melodies. I thought it was a wonderful album. But it didn't really give me the experience of Frank Zappa. My friend went and bought Them or Us as it came out. And that Saturday morning, he puts it on his record player to have a listen. And he's so astonished by this that he rings me up and he says, "You've got to come over right now and listen to this." I went darting across my town, 3/4 of an hour walk, got to his house, and we sat down and listened to Them or Us. And my life was changed completely. I was affected by the aesthetics of that album. And what it did for me was make a statement that there was all this incredible music out there, but this hierarchy of value, this sort of moral thing of saying, oh, so-and-so is this type of music, you know, like Bach is somehow intrinsically better than the Trogs Wild Thing. And when you put Zappa on, I felt it was incredibly sophisticated, but it was balanced by the fact that you would have these incredible improvisations, these beautiful melodies, an approach to composition that was rooted in rock music. That wasn't coming from jazz or anywhere, but it's rooted in rock music. It was absolutely beautiful. Some of the most beautiful. I do believe that Frank Zappa is perhaps the greatest melodist in rock music. He writes beautiful tunes when he wants to, but balancing that was noise and offense and dirt and like references to like popular culture. There was sexual lyrics. There was lyrics where he was criticizing other people from other countries. That it was full of hate. All this thing was in there together, and that struck me as being very powerful. Now, as I developed as a musician, I basically ended up having 4 touchstone artists. I like lots of music, but there's 4 touchstone artists for me. That would be John Coltrane, Miles Davis, John McLaughlin, and Frank Zappa. They're the artists I absolutely love. Other artists I enjoy, but I think I've got every John McLaughlin album. I have got probably 2/3, maybe even more Frank Zappa albums, which we're talking about 100 albums. I have a lot of Miles Davis albums and a lot of John Coltrane albums. That probably makes up a big wodge of my record collection. They really are the touchstone artists. If you go right back to the beginning of this channel, you will see there's a video where I call it's something like the 4 Titans of music, or the 4 artists that made this channel, and it's those 4 artists. And studying the fact that they're my artists, I've noticed that there's like, they fall into 2 camps. John McLaughlin and John Coltrane are exploring the idea of music being a revelation and it being elevatory. It's looking upwards and it uplifts you. It embodies angst, but it tries to escape that angst. It's like Western meditational music that has the angst and the sort of terror of our existence in the West embodied in it. And it's trying to escape it. You know, Coltrane and John McLaughlin are not Ravi Shankar. They are playing like that, but they're trying to start from that place of pain. When I heard Coltrane and John McLaughlin, I felt the pain in there and the solution of that pain. This was elevatory spiritual music. And what was interesting is John Coltrane was a black guy from America. John McLaughlin was a white guy from the UK. John McLaughlin was more rooted in rock. John Coltrane was more rooted in jazz, although a lot of the things I loved about jazz, which is going towards the free jazz, I was always interested in the chaos more than, people just playing through chord changes and being very clever. I never was totally won over by that. And so Coltrane, I felt, was trying to take the straitjacket of jazz and move it to a place where you could just do whatever you want. John McLaughlin was taking the straitjacket of rock and doing exactly the same thing. So they embodied the same thing. On the other side, there was Miles Davis and Frank Zappa, and both of those seemed to embody the street. They embodied a material view of the world. There was an acceptance of all the rights and wrongs that was there. Miles Davis had been a pimp. Miles Davis had been a heroin addict. Miles Davis had beat his wives, right? But within that sort of very tough street exterior was a quite a feminine beauty in there. Again, like Coltrane, he took the straitjacket of jazz, if you want to call it that, and he moved it towards jazz fusion. And of course, Coltrane had played with Miles, and there was that crossover going on. So they also were contained in their own bracket. Frank Zappa was like the other side of it. Now, I always suspected this, and I did a recent interview with a writer who really explored, I've forgotten his name, I'm afraid, but I'll put the link in, who had really created a very strong argument that Zappa came out of jazz, and in the late 50s, early 60s, he was basically a jazz composer, but much more in the vein of the sort of West Coast, post George Russell, Jimmy Giuffre, that type of jazz. And that, if you take his tunes and take away all the sort of postmodern cultural stuff in there, you have this very strong modernist approach to jazz, which is being informed by modern classical music. Zappa, musically, is a modernist, but in terms of his themes, he's a postmodernist. And so Zappa, again, like Miles Davis, he just represented reality. It was like someone, as he once said, they drive through and they see something going on, and then they stop and somebody says, "What's going on back there?" And he goes, "Oh, it's really weird. There was a car crash and somebody came back." And he's just reporting. He is just holding a mirror up to society and showing that what is there, right? So I saw Miles and Zappa being the same. I saw John McLaughlin and Coltrane being the same. But I also saw that Miles and Coltrane were sort of linked. And then Zappa and John McLaughlin were sort of linked. So, they were like the rock side, and then Miles and Coltrane were the jazz side. So there was a lot of these things, and I tend to see the world like that. In other words, what we had with these artists was one great big dialectic, and the dialectic was sort of heaven and earth. It was the spiritual, the uplifting, the moral, the music that elevates you, that is of worth. And then music that is just a reflection of the human condition. There's no God. There's no meaning to anything. We're in this on our own. We've got to try and work our own way out. And here it is. And this is what life is like, with all the reality in there. Okay? So I hope on this video so far, I've introduced this idea of where Zappa sits in my worldview. I became a very big Frank Zappa fan and went out into the world expecting all the musicians that I met to also love Frank Zappa, but it wasn't the case. I noticed a couple of things. There were certain musicians out there that would love Miles and Coltrane, even though to me they were either side of the dialectic. Even though to me, when they were in the same group together making Kind of Blue, it's the dialectic between Coltrane and Miles which makes it so interesting. It completes a whole. But there were certain people out there that loved Miles, but they didn't like John McLaughlin, and they didn't like Frank Zappa, and they really didn't like Frank Zappa. Now, what it was is those who were more on that certain side of seeing music as being revealing some sort of truth and being about beauty and all this sort of stuff, they found Frank Zappa ugly. That's the way to describe it. But they wouldn't say it like that. They would say this. A lot of people would go, Well, I know he's a very good musician, but his music's very impenetrable. It's not full of that sort of warmth and heart that Miles Davis has. It's all cold. That would be so the music's cold, very modernist, very sort of modern classical. But the bigger complaint would be, I don't know why he has to spoil his music with all these silly, childish, offensive lyrics. Why does he have to sing about smelling girls' pants? Why does he have to sing about penguins in bondage? What is he doing that for? That offended them. And then you could move to another level of that where they would start to say, he's a misogynist, he's a racist, he does tunes like Jewish Princess, which are anti-Semitic, and then he does Catholic Girls, which are against the Catholic religion, and then he sings songs about, that are homophobic, like He's So Gay. It's full. So what you started to see, that those were over with the Coltranes, and to some extent the Miles Davis, but I think they're biting their lip about Miles because they can just listen to the music. That aspect of Miles, the wife-beating, heroin-addicted, cocaine fiend that was a pimp, they could offset that because the music's beautiful and they can hear that mournful quality in it. But Zappa, it's in your face. John McLaughlin was too... It was too fast, too lacking some sort of platonic emotional heart that you get with authentic musicians. It was just all about feel, and it was rigid, and John McLaughlin was just playing as fast as he can, and they were all playing as fast. There's no space. Where's the beauty? There's this idea, there's a certain idea emerging here of what beauty is. But there's actually two ideas of beauty, but they're rejecting the one and they're going over to that camp. And those are the people, I think, that don't like Frank Zappa. So let's steelman their argument, which I can do because being a thoughtful kind of guy, I'm very aware of these things too. So Frank Zappa emerges in the 1960s. He emerges at the time when that big leap forward is happening in popular music, and the novelty of popular music is turning into the seriousness of rock music. Bob Dylan's emerged, and he is suddenly able to make popular music, which is very serious. It's dealing with serious things. It's no longer singing about, driving around your car and chatting up girls and getting drunk, and not wanting to go to school because you don't want to be tied down because you're a wild-eyed loner on the gates, riding towards the gates of hell. And Dylan starts to think about other things. And that generation that's coming up in the 60s that start to reject the value of their parents, which is really the effect of the Second World War. And people looking at that going, well, we don't want to go there again, do we? And the civil rights movement, the idea that everybody should be treated the same, that, we're all human beings. We shouldn't be judging people by the colour of their skin or their sexuality or their gender or any of these things. And that all starts to manoeuvre, and this music becomes, in the 60s, popular, but also powerful in its message. Now, Zappa emerges, but he also almost represents the underbelly of that. Rather than representing the hippies, Zappa's representing the freaks. He is so removed from this position that he is criticising absolutely everything he sees. He looks around, he criticises the church, he criticises the government, he criticises the Beatles for talking about love. There's no such thing as love, as he famously did on the track Oh No, which is a response to All You Need Is Love, where he says, oh no, I don't believe it, you think you know about the meaning of love. Right, so he questions that. What do you know about love, right? Zappa is politically not left-wing. He's not a Marxist. He doesn't want a revolution. He doesn't want a big Woodstock, sort of utopian idea where everyone can just have, be happy and take drugs and just all be in one big commune. That embodiment of the sort of utopian ideas that are encased in the left that we saw in the 60s. He doesn't want a part of that. All right? He doesn't want a part of that. He wants to hold a mirror up. He doesn't like drugs. He doesn't like things being out of control. His music's very complex to play. He runs it like a little cottage industry. He is into capitalism. He wants to make a profit. He wants the musicians to perform the music properly. He wants to make his creative statement. And all that goes against the sort of hippie ideal. Now, the airy-fairy types, they love the hippie ideal, right? The hippie ideal that emerged in the 60s has atrophied over the last 50 years, right? And it's now become sort of, for me, it happened, I really became aware of it when the movie The Doors came out, the Oliver Stone movie, The Doors. And this sort of celebrated this sort of Nietzschean Superman wild-eyed loner thing and, you know, put everything that we associated with Byron onto Jim Morrison. And when it came out, Frank Zappa described it as the Time Warner version of the 1960s. And it struck me that this was becoming now the mainstream. It was becoming the safe touchstone. It is becoming the thing that the hippies would have rebelled against. And those hippie values started to integrate themselves. As Frank Zappa said, the hippies turned into yuppies. They had control of everything and they brought their hippie values in. Right, so we have this, we have Frank Zappa he's sat there criticising the stuff he sees. Now, from his point of view, he is looking at the world and he's writing songs, and a little bit like a pop artist, almost like Andy Warhol. He believes he's just presenting a thing. He is recording that thing without any judgment into sort of cultural history. So if we take a tune like Jewish Princess, which is off Shake Your Booty, here he describes a Jewish princess. He says it's a particular type of person. He emulates how they talk. And as he said, when he brought this song out, all the Jewish princesses in the world turned around and said, we love this song, we now have their own song. But the other side are saying, this is anti-Semitic. Why are you doing this for? Because it's instilling hate into people. You're telling all these negative things about, you know, Jews, which is not right. And actually, Jewish organisations tried to shut the song down. And so I'm trying to explain this thing. I believe that sort of identity view of the world is offended deeply by Frank Zappa. Now, there are things called Zappologists, so they apologise for Frank Zappa. And I would argue that Jewish Princess is not anti-Semitic. It's describing a thing that actually exists in the world. It's describing a point of view. If there is any prejudice there, you have to divorce the artist from what is being said. You have to bring nuance in. You have to step back and bring some intelligence in. We don't need to dumb down art by putting it into the big lens of identity and going, oh, we don't like this. Well, but you don't understand it, do you? I don't care if I understand it because I'm clever, but if you put this out there, people who don't understand it, the thick people, will get influenced by it, and before you know it, they'll all be far right. So there's that idea that's boiling away when certain people listen to the art. It's not right, it's not right. Zappa in the 1980s then gets involved with censorship of rock music. He's in court arguing alongside Dee Snider for why Darling Nikki by Prince should be kept on Purple Rain. There's this bizarre thing going on. So he's a free speech advocate, which I am as well. Now, all well and good. I could see and argue all that, except running through Zappa's work, I do accept and believe is a strong element of misogyny. Now, I don't like to use the word misogyny, or if I'm going to use the word misogyny, I want to be able to I don't want to be inside that, not realizing that we're not actually talking about a thing. This is a word that's been created aesthetically to describe something that our opinion is not beautiful, is not nice, it's not good. All right, and so we have to keep negotiating what that is, because it's very easy to say something is just, that's misogynistic. It's like say that person's a Nazi. Oh, are they? Yes. Doesn't have to be qualified. But in Zappa's case, I feel that he inherited, now this is only my opinion, this is just my opinion, right? You've got to understand, and I'm grown up enough to step back and go, this is my opinion, challenge it, it could be wrong. But of all the great things that happened in the 1960s, all the believing that we should treat everybody the same and there's a possibility to have a wonderful utopian world, which we can all live in peace and harmony, holding hands, drinking bottles of Coca-Cola, that idea, and as much as that has produced some incredible ideas, which I think over the last 50 years have made us become more tolerant of gay people, of people with different gender views, black people, all the different peoples, all the identity groups. I think that the thing that happened in the 60s was so powerful, and us as human beings, especially in the West, should be very proud of what we've achieved here, because we do not live in a world which is like many other countries in the world, which are still extremely racist, extremely homophobic, and their ethics and morals are exacted with an iron rod. So I want you to remember that, because I believe that the 60s ideals counteracted that. So all my life, I've seen myself as a bit of a hippie. That's how I see myself, right? So inside that 1960s things, there's a certain number of values which I think weren't as positive. Now, I went to see Soft Machine last night, and John Etheridge was the great guitar player, who is like the last man standing of the original Soft Machine from the 70s, started to talk about why there was so much argumentative sort of conflict within Soft Machine in the 1970s. And he said that the generation that came up in the 1960s, which he was a member of, he said, actually, as what was the Prime Minister who said, "You've never had it so good"? Can't remember. But anyway, that generation really didn't have it so good. The slump of the war, especially in America, created a sort of quite well-off world that was advancing. Everything was getting better. My mum and dad, who are of that generation, said, you sort of left school and you just picked your job, and if you didn't like that job, you just left that job and went to another job. There was money, it was secure, you didn't have to worry about all the stuff that was right. And so what John Etheridge said is, and I think it's a profound thing that I've never really heard anyone say before, was that generation was spoiled. And so the generation that were making rock music in the 70s, if things didn't go their way, they had a flounce. And that flouncy, self-obsessed, I'm the one and everyone should listen to me attitude, right, which was naive in the 1960s. As these people grew up and got into a position of power, there emerged this sort of educated elite that thought everything should go their way, and that their virtue signalling should be seen as being the way of doing it. And it was just simple spoiltness. It was not being able to take another person's point of view. And all these rows that we see in all those bands of that era are rooted in that. And that's a very profound thing that I think is a quality of that generation. Another thing that came out of the 1960s was the idea of being off your head, that drugs will somehow take you to another plane and elevate you. Now, there is an argument that is the case, but on the whole, there was a lot of casualties. So a lot of our heroes that we saw as being so wonderful in the 1960s, like Janis Joplin and Jim Morrison and Jimi Hendrix, and Brian Jones, they all died. They're dead. Frank Zappa took the mickey out of this on a track called We're Turning Again off the albums The Mothers of Prevention, which really looks at the censorship that was emerging in America in the 1980s. But there was another thing that happened in the 1960s. It was the idea of free love. The idea that the morals around sex were silly. We could throw them away. We have the pill. If you do get pregnant, then you could go and get an abortion. And, in that negotiation, the problem was that, and this is what when you look at first wave feminism, they think that there's going to be some sort of, they're going to be emancipated by this sort of sexual revolution that's going on. And then the second wave feminists realise that's not the case. And what it creates is extreme pornography. It creates an attitude towards women that I would say is misogynistic and caused issues. A lot of the rock bands in the 70s careered across the United States of America doing all sorts of things that we are now seeing as being morally wrong. So what I'm saying here is that aspect of the 1960s, that moral is flipping. So there's a lot of extremely old rock stars hoping that nobody shines a light on their activities in the 1970s, I think. And in the last few years, the people that will be found out to be involved in the PD things and the Jeffrey Epstein stuff, they will be thinking, I think, but back then it didn't seem that bad. And now it's really bad because those morals are changing. That morality is changing, and it's right for it to change. And I have always felt that our society is too sexualized, and it is a product of the 1960s, and in the end, it is causing harm. The rise of drugs, the sort of fentanyl crisis that you've got in America, this is all rooted in another set of values, which on the whole Frank Zappa was against, but he wasn't against the idea of free love. He had a different view of it. And so that aspect of his treatment of women is evidenced in his music in the same way that it's evidenced in most rock music at the time. You only need to go and put a song on, for example, by Rainbow All Night Long and check out the lyrics of what is in there. And that is an extremely misogynistic song, which if we were to analyse it now, we would go, this is not right. It's just... now, my position is, I am a free speech advocate. I would not ban All Night Long by Rainbow. It's one of my favourite songs. It was a song that actually got me into it. I wouldn't be here for it. When I was 12 years old and I heard that song, I didn't even register what the lyrics were. All I cared was Cozy Powell's drumming and Richie Blackmore's great guitar solo, and that's Graham Bonnet's screaming voice. I just loved it. I didn't even register what it was about. And as I get older, you read it, and I think, this is awful. And my way of counteracting it would be to pull that song out on this channel and go through the lyrics and just poke fun at it. I would make it show how silly it is by taking the power away from it. But there are those in the society that will act like this. They will go, this is absolutely wrong. It's misogynistic, and I don't think it's right. And although I am morally superior, and it won't affect me and turn me into a sexist, more stupid people that I am better than will be affected, and they should not be allowed to see it. I've seen it, it won't affect me. I think we should put people in to censor these things. The people who will censor it will be clever people. They won't be affected by it, but the stupid people would be. I have been told this over and over and over by people on the left. And I say it with a straight face where you think you really believe that your moral position is absolute and that you have an elevated view of the world. Now, this will happen if you take on the utopian values that are in Christianity, Islam, in Marxism, in Nazism, in identity politics, this idea that we're going to build a better world. Now, the people on the left go, what's Andy saying? We should be trying to build a better world. Yes, but not like this. Now, so on this video, I'm trying to get across two things. I'm saying Frank Zappa is brilliant. Frank Zappa did things that affected me. I don't care what you think. Incredible music. Some of his opinions were mind-blowing, philosophical. For a rock band, from rock music, his ideas were just like, whoa. And I'm gonna read you a passage from in a bit by Frank Zappa to try and show you how these things affected my worldview. Now, those who were against that are probably going to say, well, that's why Andy's so bloody not accepting of all this sort of identity politics ideology, and he just thinks it's terrible because he's one of those people. He's not clever like us. He's because if I say anything like this in the comments, and it's this morality is just, when you're on YouTube and you're doing this thing, there are those out there that will go, oh, Andy's just after clicks. All he's doing is doing stuff to try and get people to watch. Yeah, I am. That's exactly what I'm trying to do, so I can create a platform to do something artistic. That's the payoff. That's the devil's bargain. If you want to do music, it's always there. It was there in the 1920s. It was there in the 1950s. It was there in the 1980s. It used to be called a record deal. It's the deal with the devil, right? And so I have to be very clever and sit back and going, when I'm doing this clickbaity video, which is the embodiment of capitalism, this is why they don't like it, because it's like capitalism. I'm just doing something. And look at what he's done. It's just clickbaity. He's bringing this and he's saying this. He doesn't like the Ramones. How can he not like the Ramones? I mean, the Ramones are authentic and visceral. And us people on the touchy-feely utopian side of things, we just love the Ramones because they just represent rawness. They're that raw energy. Yeah, but these people that are just with all that raw energy, aren't you a bit worried that they might, listen to some far-right sort of dogma and get influenced by it? They might do, yeah. They're probably really clever, though, even though their music's so simplistic, and I am, buying into the simplicity of the Ramones. I mean, you've got to say you like the Ramones. And when this happens on my channel, people steam in and they'll go, you obviously have never listened to this. When I did the video, which was saying all jazz sounds the same, which was a very complex video. The title was in inverted commas. It is something that crossed up. So I'm taking this comment that other people are saying, and I'm examining it, much like I am now, trying to go down the middle a little bit. And when that happened, I mean, 100 times, you need to listen to jazz. You don't know what jazz is. Have you listened to Thelonious Monk? Have you listened to John Coltrane? Have you listened to, and they'll list artists as though they just assume in their elevated moral position that I haven't listened to this stuff. He would just not know. He's ignorant. He needs to wake up. He needs to be educated. He needs to check his privilege. All these things are there. Now, all the way through this, I want to get across, and I'm trying to open these two ideas, that I do think the Achilles heel of Frank Zappa is the misogynism. And I do not think it's rooted in a sort of 60s aesthetic where he's challenging and holding not all the time. It is just the misogynism that was the product of this 1960s free love that really is embodied in so much rock music of the 1970s. When the punk came in and the new wave came in, a lot of the bands in the 1980s were challenging that view. It got challenged in the 80s, 40 years ago. And I think after that, what you had happen is bands never really went back to just singing songs about, womanizing on tour. If they did, they would do it in a postmodern, ironic point of view, except for hip-hop. So hip-hop merges and it becomes an art form with Run DMC, LL Cool J, Public Enemy. Now, I've got a Public Enemy album in the car at the moment, and although I don't agree with everything that Chuck D says, he is like a prophet that I think you want to listen to. He is. Aesthetically, I love it. It makes my hair stand on end. And that viewpoint was needed at the time. It's like the hippies coming out and they're going, this is not right. Look at this, and they're saying, like cop killer and F the police and all this type of stuff's going on. It was needed. At that point, it was needed. But again, these people grow up, the commercial things come in and it atrophies. And now we have a situation where hip-hop can be more misogynistic than Frank Zappa ever was. Think about stuff which is far more offensive, and we're all supposed to sit back and go, well, we don't want to criticise that group of people because they're a protected group, because they're in one of those arbitrary identity groups. Yeah, I know, but those guys are millionaires. They're part of the system. I mean, look what's going on. That's what's going on at the moment with this P. Diddy thing. We're suddenly going, he's part of the establishment, isn't he? He's a billionaire. He's linked into this and that. It's wretched, isn't it? That's what's going on. Yes, but he is an oppressed minority, isn't he? No. Right? So that is the problem with Frank Zappa, is the misogyny that's in there. Now, the thing that really promoted this is that I have always had that nagging doubt about Zappa. I'm quite, I don't mind him singing about the sort of more scatological stuff. I don't mind him. So if you take a track like Penguin in Bondage, that is a response to Venus in Furs by Velvet Underground. This is where the sort of hatred between Lou Reed and Frank Zappa emerges. And so he takes the sort of faux pompous, alternative view of the world that is proffered by the Velvet Underground, and he parodies it and he turns it into something ridiculous, Penguin in Bondage. I don't think that embodies this type of thing, but I think beyond the lyrics even, I mean, if you take something like Bobby Brown, which like takes on sort of feminism, and he's not a feminist, and he basically says that, feminism has turned these sort of very male jock-like people into gay people. It's homophobic. It's funny, but when you listen to it, it's almost like a comedy song. And all this horrendous stuff that is in there is done to actually a beautiful tune, right? A very simple, beautiful pop tune. That tune went to #1 in some country where they never understood what he was saying, Holland or Norway or somewhere like that. I find that interesting. I know where Zappa's coming from. Now, as I said, what motivated me to do this video has been watching the interviews with Moon Unit, who has just brought a book out about her childhood. Now, Moon Unit was the first child of Frank Zappa. She was born, I think, a year before me, 1967. And it seems that, her upbringing wasn't great. Even though she was the child of a rock star living in sort of the hills of Hollywood and all that type of stuff, she seems to be neglected a lot. Her dad really was only interested in his career, and his mom and her mom seemed to have some sort of problem with her. She was had favourites in the kids, and then when Zappa died, the sort of business and all the money was passed on to Gail, and then when Gail died, she just gave it to, I think, Ahmet and Diva, and Dweezil and Moon were left out. And she describes something. Now, I've got no opinion about Gail Zappa, but she doesn't sound like the best character. But the apologists for Gail would say, yeah, but she was living in a pretty rotten relationship where most of the time her husband was out on tour, and they all had to accept his philandering and adulterous behavior. It was in their face, and it was in the face of the kids. They describe a house which is full of naked people, that there's pornography lying around, and I believe that, as a free speech advocate, I want to explain how I see this, is that once you become an adult, you assume a bunch of responsibilities. If you've got the responsibility to have your own house and make your own food and keep yourself alive and not go around killing people or stealing, that's your responsibilities. And if you can fulfill those responsibilities, you get certain rights. And those rights include freedom of expression and freedom of speech. But children haven't got those responsibilities, so they don't necessarily get the full set of rights. Now, I'm going to try and explain that, because I know when I'm saying it, the left will go, "Whoa, what's he saying? What's he saying? What's he saying?" Because they are judging the world entirely from their emotional, visceral point of view. It's what seems nice. I have the right to drive a car. The reason I've got a right to drive a car is because I learnt to drive a car and I passed a test that says I can now drive a car. That is my right. If you haven't got that, it is not your right to drive a car, right? And I think children should be protected in what they see. So censorship should be there in terms of children. We have a real problem with the internet at the moment. And there is fundamentally where I disagree with Frank Zappa, because he would have said, someone famously asked him, would you allow a child to swear and say whatever they want? And he went, well, yeah. Now, Moon tells a story of actually her dad going, we'll go for a trip up to New York. and he takes her and I think Dweezil up, sticks her in a hotel room, and it's not really a trip to take them out and spend some time with them. They're stuck in a room, and then he goes next door and has sex with some groupie, which they can hear through the wall. This colours my opinion of Frank Zappa. You see, you thought I was going to apologise to him all the way through, but this paints him in a certain light for me, which I am not comfortable with, right? The man has failings, and they're major failings, I think. Now, the question is, artistically, is that worth the sacrifice for the music? Now, all the Zappa fans, all the Zappa haters, will be going, no, it's definitely not. Right? I'm doing this video to try and get myself to a point where I might come up with a decision, because I haven't got a clue about this one. I'm doing what Zappa does. I'm just putting it all out there for you. I believe he's a brilliant musician. I believe that he was an incredible composer. There are so many things that happened in music history that he innovated. You know, not just electric guitar and synthesis and the use of the studio and the use of computer music, but also the idea of having your own label, of owning what you do. He predicted the internet and Spotify. He was, on that level, an absolute genius. But there is something in the music that when you get to my age as an adult and you put on those albums, where you do feel slightly queasy when you are listening to certain tracks on there that seem to not be a reflection of some sort of childish view of the world. You know when Zappa's doing that. You know when he's going with something, because he is so vicious. There is a celebration which you feel. So something like Jazz Discharge Party Hats off Man from Utopia. Musically, it's an incredible piece of music. It influenced me hugely. So this is a tune where Zappa's on stage and they do this sort of cod jazz poetry thing, and he's reciting a story about a groupie. He then takes that discussion, which is semi-sung, semi-spoken, and he gives it to Steve Vai, and Steve Vai transcribes every little, not just the notes, but every little scrape on acoustic guitar. So he uses this thing which is truly low and offensive and all the things that we do not associate with high art, and he creates this incredibly dense, modernist, classical composition that seems to also act as some sort of free jazz improvisation, which then sort of pulls all the things down and you don't know where you are, and I think that's incredible. But there we have the crux of it, is that story he tells in that, which is, he would say, is a true story. This is what people do, what musicians do on the road. But I don't feel like this, I don't know. I'm going to read the quote out because I keep thinking I'm going to do it. I'll just go and get, so I've got here an album called You Are What You Is. That title for me, You Are What You Is, embodies a certain view I have of the world, which challenges all the sort of identitarian stuff that I'm not so keen on. All right. On here, there's a track called Dumb All Over. This was recorded in 1981, nearly 44 years ago. It's probably recorded 45 years ago, where he raps. He raps a track when rap is just a thing. And he talks about the situation in the Middle East. And he describes America's involvement with it. And if you put it on now, it is relevant still, incredibly relevant still. It's incredible how futuristic he is in his viewpoint. Now, I get asked, which side are you on, Israel or Hamas? And I'm not on a side. The problem going on there is there's one ideologically captured group against another ideologically captured group. And they have a worldview that they think has to be enacted. It's a utopian worldview, and utopian worldviews are always a death cult. You either line up and accept their worldview or you're wiped off. And certain groups just get wiped off for their very existence. And so Hamas want to get rid of all the Jews, and the extreme far right Israelis want to get all rid of, and the only difference is that Israel is playing a game where they're trying to make out they're not doing that, but it's horrendous. We are living through this right now. And so what is the solution to this? For me, we have to push against the identity view of the world. Right, the ideological left, those captured by the ideas that have come out of sort of leftist, post-Marxist, sort of critical theory, postmodernism, intersectionality, queer theory, all that line of ideas, which are perfectly great. I have no problem with them. I just don't want them to be enacted as though it's the truth. I don't want people to say it's science when they're quoting one of these philosophical pieces, because it's not science, it's philosophy. Right? It's a different thing. And I feel, looking at the world at the moment, that actually the ideals of the 1960s were really beneficial up until about 15 years ago. But the atrophying of the politics of identity and the ideological aspects of that are now moving us to a point which is absolutely terrifying. And you could see, when you step back, that the horrors of the Second World War, the realization that a Western civilized country could do the things they did, created an approach which was mitigated by tolerance and a sort of liberal respect for the argument, a liberal respect for the other people's point of view. And I think the ideological left, and anyone watching that's on the ideological left, they will absolutely find this hard to accept. They will really find it hard to accept that their viewpoint is ideological. But the test is whether you feel you're right or wrong. If you feel you're right, if you go, this is not right and it's really bad and something should be done about it, that's ideological, right? If you are thinking, I don't know how to solve this, shall we all get round the table? So the bizarre thing is those communitarian viewpoint that we should all hold hands and live in this utopian thing are the ones that don't want to have anyone's point of view and sit down and go, what is the best situation? Let's have your opinion. Now, we know if we got these ideological elements that are out there, any of them, if you've got the North Koreans, or we got Putin, or we got China, or we got Israel, or we got Hamas, if we got any of them and put them together, even in America, if you got the MAGA lot and or the lefty lot, if you put them all together at the moment, it's not an argument to go, I respect your opinion, I hope you respect mine. We've got to be, let's find which grade of the dialectic would be best for this situation, because this situation is here, so we need to be about here, so we pull it over to here. But this problem is here, so we need to pull it over to here. That is how this should be working. Now, all of this is based upon morality. And right at the top of this video, and I return to it near the end of this video, is the idea that our ethics are embodied in aesthetics. So the way musicians or artists or filmmakers or storytellers, I've got a bit of a tickle in my throat, I do apologise, that those people, they just react, they should react in a non-ideological way. They should hold a mirror up. Artists often feel like it's not them that's making the art, that they are receiving something. And that is because they open themselves to the messages that are out there in the universe. And that's a very spiritual thing. That's the Coltrane, McGofflin, Mahavishnu side of me. But I'm going to read the last paragraph of this long essay that Zappa put at the back end of this album. And he says this: the quality of our lives, if we think of this matter in terms of how much of what we individually consider to be beautiful are we able to experience every day, seems an irrelevant matter, now that all the decisions regarding the creation and distribution of works of art must pass under the limbo bar, also known as the bottom line, along with things like taste and the public interest. all tied like a tin can to the wagging tail of the sacred prime rate poodle. The aforementioned festering poot is coming your way at a theatre or drive-in near you. It wakes you up at every morning as it droozles out of your digital clock radio. An arts council somewhere is getting a special batch ready with little tuxedos on it so you think it's precious. Frank Zappa, April the 1st, 1981. I cannot tell you how that view of what he describes is that the quality of our life is not how much money we got or what we own. It's about what is beautiful and how much beauty we can experience every day. And then he says that our society is in control of that. And so we do not get enough beauty in our lives. Now, the reason we want to experience beauty is because it changes us. It affects us. It gets us to see the world in a different place. Once we have an idea of what we think is beautiful, and if a lot of people are having the same idea that that is beautiful, or that the Royal Mail were wrong to do what they did because look how it made those people feel. Once you get to that point, ethics can move. The thing that stops that is the idea that you are already morally there and that you know. We go right back to the beginning of philosophy. Why was Socrates the wisest? Because he knew that he knew nothing. And I feel that that is a quality in Zappa's work, a respect for free expression. And in that free expression, although we get an incredible worldview of him, we also do get embodied the attitudes of the time. And that is where the misogyny is. And we can say, there's the misogyny. That is the time. And rather than go, isn't it bad? It needs to be censored. I don't like it. We should be saying this. Isn't it amazing that in the 1960s, when everybody was trying to do good, that actually some of the values they had weren't good? And isn't it interesting when you go back through history, a lot of the people who think they are morally right and are putting the rules in to say what is morally right are actually doing bad stuff. So isn't it the point that those out there trying to censor people, those out there shouting that this is the way we should live, this is what we should say, this is what we should do, those are the ones that in their worldview, although there may be great worth and there may be great ethical strength in what they're saying, there is also the fact that they could be just as wrong as the people that went before them, because history shows us this. And the way to counteract is to say, I don't know. And put the Frank Zappa album on and listen to it. And as much as you hate what is being said, rather than looking to him to hate, realize that your view of utopia may need questioning inside you, because utopia can only be enacted if you are willing to do something about those who do not agree with you about what utopia is. Now, I am now going to say a title of a Frank Zappa album. He made an album called The Man from Utopia. And so, as I say this, because I didn't know I was going to get to this point, again, Frank Zappa for me has done what he always does, and which is why I love him, is that I start to think, was he on to this? Was he on to this? Are we all a bit arrogant to assume we know what he intended? Can we never know what the artist intends? Is this sort of postmodernist view that it doesn't matter what the artist intends, is that relevant? Is it all just about my attitudes and what I think about it? Isn't that a recipe for prejudice? Isn't that a recipe for intolerance and judgment and thinking that you know? Isn't this a recipe for the very malaise and evil that is out there in the world at the moment? Maybe we need to hold a mirror up to ourselves and stop judging everybody else. I did try my best to when I started this video, I thought I may get to a point where I really criticise Frank Zappa. And I do not like the way he lived his personal life. I'm a big family guy that thinks that you've got to look after your kids first and foremost, even above art and music. But there is something very powerful in his music for me. But if you don't get it, it's not a problem. You just don't need to get angry about it. Thanks for watching this video. If you like it, put a like on it. If you want to see some more, so you can subscribe. If you want to support me, you can go over to my Patreon. You can become a free member or a paid member. There's loads and loads of content there. All sorts of different stuff. And if you don't want to become a patron because you know it will waste your time, because it will, because there's a lot of stuff there. But if you don't, you can put some money into the PayPal chip jar down below. And if you want to support this wonderful place where I now do my YouTube videos, where I found my home, which is actually a charity, then there is a link to the Jellyman's Arts Heritage Trust, and you can support them a little bit. They're trying to do all sorts of good, especially you lefties who like all that sort of lefty stuff. They're doing loads of lefty stuff here, which I support 100%. Because you'll never know what I think, really. Because this is artifice. This is YouTube. And I might be lying.